So we're talking about grace today. So I first wanted to share with you a letter that my grandma, whose name was Grace, sent to me like in the 80s. Now, my grandma was a devout Christian. So bear that in mind as I read this letter to you. She said, "Dear Susie," because that's what my family of origin calls me, a Susie. "The other day I went to a local Christian bookstore and saw a Honk If You Love Jesus bumper sticker. I was feeling particularly sassy that day because I had just come from a thrilling choir performance followed by a thunderous prayer meeting, so I bought the sticker and I put it on my bumper. Boy, I'm glad I did. What an uplifting experience followed. I was stopped at a red light at a busy intersection, just lost in thought about the Lord and how good He is, and I didn't notice that the light had changed. Oh, it's a good thing someone else loves Jesus, because if He hadn't honked, I'd have never noticed. I found that lots of people love Jesus. While I was sitting there, the guy behind started honking like crazy, and then he leaned out his window and he yelled, 'For the love of God, go, go, Jesus Christ, go.' What an exuberant cheerleader he was for Jesus. Everyone started honking, and I just leaned out my window and started waving and smiling to all those loving people. I even honked my horn a few times to share in the love. Well, there must have been a man from Florida back there, because I heard him yelling something about a sunny beach. I saw another guy waving in a funny way with only his middle finger stuck up in the air. I asked my teenage grandson in the back seat what that meant, and he said that it was probably a Hawaiian good luck sign or something. Well, I've never met anybody from Hawaii, so I leaned out the window and I gave him the good luck sign back. My grandson burst out laughing. He was enjoying this religious experience too. A couple of the people were so caught up in the joy of the moment that they got out of their cars and started to walk towards me. I bet they wanted to pray or ask what church I attended, but this is when I noticed that the light changed. So I waved to all my sisters and brothers grinning and drove on through the intersection. I noticed I was the only car that got through the intersection before the light changed again, and I felt kind of sad to leave them after all the love that we had shared. So I slowed the car down, leaned out of the window, and gave them all the Hawaiian good luck sign one last time before I drove away. Praise the Lord for such wonderful folks. Love, Grandma." Okay, so clearly that wasn't really my grandma. But she exhibited a lot of grace, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. It just totally cracked me up as I read it. Okay. I don't think that in Unity and in New Thought we talk about grace enough, because grace is that ever-present love of the divine of God that is always giving of itself in unlimited and infinite ways. It's always present, always present. And part of the journey for us is to become awake and aware of how present grace is in our lives. So I'm going to talk about grace in three ways today. The first way is I'm going to talk about grace as benevolence, and then I'm going to talk about grace as mercy, as that something that kind of wraps itself around us when we're going through some pretty broken times in our lives. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about grace as the everyday grace that appears for us all the time. It's always happening, and ours, again, is to become awake and aware to it. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is grace as benevolence. Now, the word benevolence means a desire to do good to others. And I'm going to add to this, in this case, no matter what. That's a big add, isn't it? A big addition to it. A desire to do good to others no matter what. So we're going to start with Charles Fillmore, a co-founder of Unity, his definition of grace. He says that grace is that we will never reap the full harvest of our error thinking, and we will always reap more good than we sow. Now, I want us to really think about this, because thank God. Can you imagine if we actually did reap the full harvest of our error thinking? Grace is that we will always reap more good than we sow. So here's one thing I want to say about this, because in New Thought, we hear a lot about the word karma. And what I want to say here is grace trumps karma. Every time, grace trumps karma. So in New Thought, karma is that, what goes around comes around. Whatever it is that you put out, it's going to come back to you. And there's a principle to absolutely support that. We believe that, what it is that we put out is going to come back to us. And with Charles's definition of grace, what we recognize is that whatever error or errors that we put out, that we're never going to reap the full harvest of those errors. So there is this school of thought that if we do something pretty horrible in this lifetime, that we're either going to karmically experience that or get that back in this lifetime or in another lifetime. But grace tells us something different. Grace tells us, first of all, that this tit for tat isn't necessarily true. And grace tells us that the moment that we open our hearts and the moment that we line up with the divine, with the true essence of our beingness, and we live from this higher consciousness, that not only can it lessen, quote unquote, the karmic debt, but that in many, many cases, it will literally erase that karmic debt. That's pretty great news, isn't it? And here's the thing about this is that as we look, and all of us have probably read about people or have people in our own lives that they've done something pretty horrendous, but then they've had an awakening and they've totally changed their lives. And now, because of this experience of being, living so in error, they're now ambassadors of love and of goodness. And that's what I mean by that we can literally erase those things that we feel that we have done in the past that we think may come back to us, but also recognizing what grace is. So when I came in on Tuesday morning, there was a little booklet on my desk from Unity. And interestingly enough, I already knew I was talking about grace. It's titled Grace and Gratitude. So Reverend Paul Hasselbeck, who used to be the dean at Unity Institute, he's also a friend of ours, wrote an article in this book, and I want to share some of this with you because this is grace as benevolence, the desire to do good to others no matter what. So he says in Galatians, it says that you reap whatever you sow. And he said, and as a true student of Unity teachings, he learned, just as we were talking about, that that's not always necessarily so because there is a higher principle or law, and that's the principle and the law of love. So what he shares is that he went to his favorite Starbucks one day, and there was a table next to him with an older gentleman and a younger gentleman. And he recognized that these were two ministers. So he said, I have to admit, I started kind of listening in, and he realized that the older gentleman was mentoring the younger one. And so the older minister said, tell me, how did your parents treat you when you did something wrong, or from their perspective when you sinned? And he said, without missing a beat, the broad smile came across this younger man's face, and he said, no matter what, my parents always offered me grace. And Paul said that was kind of a foreign thought to him because his parents didn't offer him grace. He was punished for any time that he committed an error in his life. And he said, I never really considered grace in this way because he always thought of grace as something that he thought of it in perspective to, this is what God is grace, but he didn't really put a human face to it. So he goes on to say that in the revealing word, Charles says that grace, all good, divine mind, God, the principle of divine benevolence, it is that permeates the universe. So he said, what if grace is one way that we ourselves could use benevolence? He goes on to say, instead of punishment or retribution for a perceived slight or wrong, we offer grace. When another errs or makes a mistake, instead of condemnation or punishment, we offer grace. And I thought, That is so beautiful. And let me say here, and I say this every time, it is important to set healthy boundaries, and if there is any kind of abuse, by all means, set healthy boundaries. But you guys, the reality is, I don't know about you, but I know in my humanness that I can hold on to those error things that I think somebody else has done, even such as popping out in front of me in traffic, or somebody's been rude. I watched a thing on Facebook the other day, and it was just so beautiful, and it was a girl who was in her car, and she was just saying that she has learned that when people do something like cut you off in traffic, or even if they give you the Hawaiian good luck signal, or say somebody is rude to you, she said, I never respond in kind. She said, because what I recognize is that I don't know what's going on with that person. I don't know maybe what's going on in their life today, or what their life has been like up until that. And so even though she didn't use these exact words, she always offers grace. And she always offers kindness and love instead of showing up in the same way. Now that's a novel thing, isn't it? Because in our humanness, when somebody's kind of rude to us, we can kind of get right back in there, can't we? And yet, when you look at it, we are expressions of God. I'm not all that God is, but all that I am is God. We are God expressing. How can we not give grace freely? How can we not do that? And how different would our world be? How different would your family dynamic be if we offered grace more freely? So that's the first aspect of grace. And Reverend Rick Schumacher, who Dave Schumacher used to be the minister years ago, Rick is in Akron, he said, grace is the love of God poured out upon us that fills us to overflowing so that we in turn can pour it out upon others. And that is absolutely true. Okay, so now we're going to talk about grace as mercy. Reverend John Bierman said, grace is not a free pass from Spirit, allowing us to escape pain and heartache. It's a deeper understanding that the foundation of the universe is spiritual and that everything has a purpose and ultimate promise. That promise is God doesn't cause pain, but God will see us through it. God's grace will see us through the darkest nights and the most difficult times in our lives. And Rick again says, this is grace that warms the heart and heals every concern. This is grace that wraps itself around us and comforts us in difficult times. How many of us, in hindsight, can recognize that grace is what got us through those times when we felt really broken open or broken down? Yes? When my husband unexpectedly died 4 years ago, I had no doubt that it was grace that got me through that. And especially in that first week, because anybody who's experienced a sudden loss of someone, you can't even wrap your mind around what is going on. And I kind of visioned grace as like this kind of translucent fabric that just wraps itself around so that I didn't have to feel the reality yet, because I needed to make a lot of decisions in that first week. And of course, what we also know is that with time, the pain comes, and it comes in big ways. But what I can tell you is that when I know that it was grace that saw me through that, and it was grace that helped me to get back up and to integrate back into life. Because when you're going through a loss of any kind like that, you feel like you're never going to breathe again. You feel like you're never going to be normal again. You feel like you're never going to be able to have joy again. But grace is that something that just, again, it comforts us and it guides us and it helps us through those times. And, I want to say that if you are going through a rough time in your life right now, just to open yourself up to that grace, and you will feel it, and you will see how it is guiding you. That is grace as mercy. And lastly, I want to talk about grace as the everyday experience. I like to think of it as the more you notice grace, the more you notice grace. The more you notice it, the more you see it. Here's the thing about grace, it's always present, always. And ours, again, is to become awake and aware to it. So way back in the 70s, it was like 74 or something, I had a Volkswagen Beetle. And anybody who drove a Volkswagen Beetle at that time knew that it did not have good heating or defrost. And so I lived in Ohio, and it was a really bad winter day. And so I start out for work, and I get to the end of my street, and there's a hole this big that I can see out of my windshield. And I'm thinking I probably should get out and scrape my windshield, but it's cold, and I didn't want to do it. So I turn on to the street, which is a relatively busy street, and I'm driving, and the hole is getting smaller and smaller, and it was like something just pressed it upon me, pull over right now. And so I pulled over, and I got out of my car, and about 2 feet in front of me was a stopped garbage truck. If I had not stopped, I would have ran smack into that garbage truck. Now, I wasn't even in Unity at the time, but I recognized the grace that was present in that. And that's the thing, you guys, is grace often shows up as this pressing urge, this, for some people, they hear a voice, it's a thought, it's just something presses in so strongly and guides you, and you know it. How many of us have had that experience? How many of us sometimes haven't followed it? How'd that go for you? And so people will often ask me, well, how do you know it's the voice? It's practice, practice, practice. And believe me, you will learn to recognize that, that it is the voice of that. As I said, when I came in on Tuesday morning, and this is the everyday grace, that booklet was there. I went to turn on one of my very favorite ministers that I like to listen to, and guess what talk came up? Grace. And here's the thing, it wasn't the most recent talk. I was clean. I'm like purging right now. So I was reorganizing my books in my office at home, and I have them almost all organized except for a pile about this big. I went into my office the other day, and the book on the very top of the pile, which I didn't even realize, was called Living in Grace by Joel Goldsmith. And the thing is, this happens every single week. Every week, I'm constantly amazed at what shows up. But I've also really practiced. I've practiced recognizing, and I've practiced being grateful. And, just so grateful that, wow, there it is again, there it is again, there it is again, there it is again. So when Paul and I were on our journey out west, Paul has a Toyota Tacoma, and he got 4-wheel drive specifically so we could do some 4-wheel driving, on some trails. So when we're out there, we decide we're going to go from St. Elmo to Tin Cup, 2 old mining towns. They're the coolest old mining towns. They look just like they did way back. And so we start up this path, and it's boulders. And it's like, boom, 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 And initially, Paul backs down. He's like, nope, I'm not going to do it. We start the other way, and then he says, nope, we're going to do it. So we start back up this path. Well, I just want to tell you this, first of all. This path is supposed to take 1 hour and 15 minutes. It took us 3.5 hours, if that's any indication of how interesting this path was. And it was big boulders and things you had to get over, and we honestly never went over 5 miles an hour, and normally it was about 3 miles an hour. So we get to the Continental Divide, we're excited to be right there, and we start down, and we come to a place where it doesn't look like there's any way that we're going to be able to get through this place. Now, I knew that my sweetheart was stressing on this one. This is him looking out for 15 minutes just trying to figure out, how am I going to get my truck through this place? And, at one point he said, honey, I think we're going to have to turn around and go back. I'm like, great, because it was like boom, boom, boom the whole way. But then, all of a sudden, out of the blue, a Toyota Tundra shows up with 2 somewhat younger guys in it. And so Paul and these 2 guys get out, and they talk about how to maneuver this. And so they go first, and then Paul went, and literally the truck was practically on its side, but we got through it. That was grace, that this truck showed up. Well, like minutes after that, Paul's light comes on that says that his tire is low. He gets out and looks, and sure enough, the tire is low. Now, I'm like, I'm okay, but I didn't realize he was totally stressing, because if that tire gets flat, we don't even know where you could possibly change a tire along the way. So here's the thing, though. We made it down, and we made it into Tin Cup, just as this storm is coming in. However, he was able to get that tire changed right before it started raining. In fact, as we were walking to the restaurant, it was starting to rain. The thing is that we recognized in the moment the grace that was happening. I mean, the whole way that these guys showed up, that we were so grateful to be in Tin Cup, and then the storm is coming, but it didn't hit until we were actually done with it. And this is the kind of stuff, you guys, that is happening all the time in your life. I promise you that it is. But we have to become awake and aware to it, and start really being grateful for it. Start recognizing it. Many of you may know too that Paul went on a 6-week bicycle ride from Sedalia, Missouri to the uppermost corner tip of Maine in 2015. And when he talked to me, and he's talked to me numerous times about this, but he said the presence of grace was so profound on this journey in like so many ways. But he was telling me that in that 6-week period, he never got rained on. Now, it wasn't that it didn't rain. There were many times when it was raining all around him, when there were these horrible storms that were approaching, and he would make it someplace just at the moment that he would be in undercover, and then it would pour down. He said that at one point he got to this camping ground, and nobody was there, and so he was able to get this spot right in the middle of the pavilion. And he said when he got in there, it waited until he got in there, poured down rain all night, and his was the only spot that wasn't wet. But it was profound to him, the grace that carried him through. And I really know in my heart, and this is for all of us, you guys, that grace, it's always present, but when we allow ourselves to become aware of it, and I can't even say it presents itself more, but we flow differently with it because we're aware of it. It's almost that we expect it. We expect that grace is going to be here in each and every day and in each and every moment, and it is. Remember that grace is the divine love that is pouring out and expressing itself in your life without exception in unlimited and infinite ways. And I think, how much of our day are we aware of that? How much of our day are we in that awareness? And how much do we miss? How many times do we miss those moments where, boy, grace was right there? So this week, I just want to encourage you, first of all, to think about how you can be the presence of grace all around you. How you can express, I think, how can we not express grace when that is our true nature? So how can you be that presence of grace? And then I just want to encourage you to be open and aware and anticipate that you're going to experience grace throughout your day. You could wake up in the morning and say something like, I am so grateful for grace that is going out before me and making my way clear. Just that little thing right there is enough to open you up to it. So I'm going to invite you to join me in affirming this together. I am so grateful for grace going out before me this day and making my way clear. And I am grateful that I recognize this grace as it is happening. So in closing, I just want to say to you, have a grace-filled day and have a grace-filled week. And namaste. Namaste. because it's